Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to look at the Celtic world, mainly the Celtic world and the Mediterranean, but we're going to primarily focus on the Celtic world. And to begin with, let me start by saying that the Celts, they were the epitome of barbarians to the Greeks and the Romans. They were the original barbarians to the Romans, and they came to be the most feared barbarians to the Greeks. The Celts lived primarily in Western and Central Europe, and the topic of the Celts had a fair bit of controversy attached to it. And to fully explain, to fully discuss the Celts, we have to do some explaining. We have to explain what we mean when we say Celt, because the term Celt refers to a large group of related languages that and peoples that inhabit, and the languages are spoken from Spain and France to the British Isles to Central Europe and even into Central Asia Minor. The Asia Minor Celts were known as the Galatai or the Galatoi. We know them better as the Galatians. Now, the Romans called these people the Galatei, Gauls, and Gaul has largely come to mean, in modern parlance, France proper, or an extended France that includes the lowlands and parts of the Rhine land. Now, we use Celt or Celtic to designate these people because Gaul has a geographic connotation in our contemporary understanding. In contemporary parlance, Celts are associated with the Irish or the Scots Gaels, Welshmen, Cornishmen, and Bretons. These peoples, and in their places, in the places that they hail from, they are the Celtic fringes, and they should be placed in our understanding of Celtic, but they were pretty remote from the core heartland of the Celtic civilization. Now, interestingly enough, they were members of the Celtic fringe when the Celts held Western and Central Europe. The core of Celtic civilization was located in eastern France and what is now southern Germany. Now that we have sort of cleared up what we mean when we say Celts and sort of given a geographic designation for the areas that we will be looking at, I want to begin and move forward with our examination of who the Celts were. Now, the Celts were first referenced in Greek sources in the 6th century BCE, as living in the areas where the Danube River originates. Now, the Greeks, through colonists and merchants, principally from the area around the what is now the present-day city of Marseille, they began to make regular contact with the Celts, and they began to increasingly trade goods with the Celts. Wine being a very popular item that the Celts were eager to get their hands on. And there is a nice story about the first Celts to try wine, later invading Italy to find out where this wonderful stuff was made. Now, from the beginning, the sources are quite clear that the Celts were a group of related barbarian peoples who lived in an area that covered a very large expanse of territory. Archaeology reveals a much more complicated culture than the literary sources tells us. There are two archaeological phases recognized for Celtic civilization. The Hallstatt period, which gets its name from a site in Austria, and that area was a major salt mining area from roughly 800 to 450 BCE. This period sees a dramatic shift in the material culture in eastern France and southern Germany. Iron technology is adopted. Agriculture spreads. Villages become larger, and defensive structures are also built to protect these villages, and they are manned at these settlements. Now, the Hallstatt period was followed by the Latian period, which extends from roughly 400 to 50 BCE. Now, the Celtic defensive structures were made up of ditches and palisades that enclosed the villages or towns. The settlements boasted large garden areas, animal pens, and of course manufacturing buildings or districts. Gates and ceramics were also to be found in the Celtic settlements. Now, these settlements represented concentrations of peoples in the hundreds and later thousands that can be viewed as infant cities. These people were very imaginative and adaptable. They very quickly became skilled iron workers. They engaged in long-distance trade with various mercantile peoples from the eastern Mediterranean, principally the Greeks. They were primarily salt traders. Their trade was regional at first, but expanded to the Greek colonies and later down to the Etruscan cities of central Italy. Now, the Celts also made contact with peoples in northeast Italy. Now, these contact with different peoples had a great effect on Celtic civilization. The demand for Celtic salt and iron between 600 and 400 BCE stimulated the trade for salt and iron, stimulated the Celts to develop more sophisticated towns, and we call these more sophisticated towns oppidums. The oppidum were large fortified zones that had relatively low populations, but were engaged in manufacturing. They had areas for concentrated agriculture, and they also had districts for specialized trade. All of these sites also hint at the rise of a ruling elite, what we would consider ruling local aristocrats, and of course chieftains. The burial mounds of the Celtic elite reflect a great deal about their society and their culture. They also help to identify products that were flowing into Celtic lands that stimulated their development. We find Etruscan and Greek ceramics. We find wine, jewelry, textiles from the Eastern Mediterranean and also from the Russian steppes. We also find African ivory at Hallstatt, hinting at access to the prestige goods from all of the areas that we've been examining. And all of these indeed grave goods present the image that the Celtic elite had access to all of these goods due to their activity, their participation in this regional salt and iron trade. Now, the Celts became experts at harvesting the forest products of Europe. In addition to salt and iron, they traded timber, hides, woolen, flax, and of course slaves. And the timber was an item that was always in great demand in the Mediterranean. The timber was used for shipbuilding and also in building construction. So having access to timber, having a reliable source of timber along with salt went a long way to facilitating the accessibility of these prestige goods for the Celtic elites. Now, all of those goods that the Celts had were in great demand to the Mediterranean world, I should say. The expansion of trade results in the expansion of Celtic economic and political power into the area of eastern France, where the Seine, the Loire, and the Danube and the Rhine rivers all come together. Now, the Celts, from their spread across Gaul, they ventured into Spain. They made it to Spain by the 3rd century BCE. The Celts at this point migrate in waves into the British Isles. The isolation and uncoordinated movements leads to the development of many languages, many dialects among these different Celtic peoples. Now, trade again spurred these developments in Celtic civilization. By 300 BCE, they had developed a pretty sophisticated culture in Gaul and southern Germany, with political structures and economic systems that will later provide the bedrock for the later Roman provincial administration and the commercial success that the Romans would have. By 300 BCE, There were Celtic adaptations of the Greek and Etruscan alphabets. The priestly caste known as the Druids had developed by the time, and the success of Celtic mercantile pursuits leads to the development of a number of sophisticated wheeled vehicles. Because again, the Celts are making, unlike the Mediterranean powers, unlike the other powers, they're not sailing. They're transporting their goods over land, so they need to develop these wheeled vehicles, these carts and these wagons to haul their goods from the point of origin, from the point where they are harvested to a manufacturing center, down to points of contact with their trade partners. Now, the Latin loanwords for carts and harnesses, as a result of the Celtic sophistication with wheeled vehicles, all come from Celtic words. The burials of elites were even known to contain carts. It really makes sense for people living in Central Europe that they would develop the very sophisticated carts, while the Germans who lived in the Baltic region, they developed very sophisticated boats. The Celt traditions and technologies are the source for the carts and the later Roman innovations during the imperial period. Now, all of this trade and development did not dull the martial prowess of the Celts. They remained very skilled and capable warriors in their own right, and this trait served them well when they migrated into the Iberian Peninsula. Now, the Romans reported that when the Romans got into the Iberian Peninsula, they began to encounter these Celtic groups. And the Romans reported that the Celts would go into battle naked with these long slashing swords, and they had the blue tattoos, and that they were very exceptional infantry. And the Romans could appreciate that because the Roman army was essentially an infantry army. Their shock action was infantry. Now, the Romans at this point, they took a very descriptive look at the Celts. They love to describe them, and they love to point out how large the Celts were. The Celts were these hulking brutes compared to these rather diminutive Romans. They love to describe them as being huge people with either red or blonde hair and a wild, crazy look in their eyes. The Celts were noted for their battle strategy of charging wildly at an opponent, breaking enemy formations before a proper battle can be engaged. And they primarily fought in an open order tactic. One of the reasons that the Romans were able to gain control of the Latin League, or even build a confederation of their own and retain members, was that the Roman army was one of the very few forces in Italy that was capable of holding together, holding their line in the wake of a Celtic charge. The Celts in Britain, they retained the use of war chariots and increasingly came to protect themselves with body armor and equipment much to the equivalent of the Romans. Now, in 300 BCE, the Celts, who were not wild warriors of fantasy, they were very disciplined and very capable fighters, and they could fight in very structured order. The Celts stimulated the development of Rome and in the wider Greek world. Across the Alps, they began to settle. They began to cross the Alps, and they began to settle in northern Italy, north of the Po River. The tribes who settled there bore the names similar to those in Eastern Gaul. These were the Boii, the Senones, the Insubres, and a group of these tribes drifted down into the Po River Valley. And they positioned themselves where they could easily swoop down into the Etruscan cities and harass them. And they were also capable of harassing the young city of Rome. Now, in 390 BCE, a group of Celts swept down from the Po River Valley, and they began to attack Etruscan cities. Now, this army of Celts stumbled onto a Roman army on July 18th, 390 BCE. This event was the first time that the Romans and the Celts fought each other, and at this time, Rome was only a very small Italian power, fielding an army roughly of 15,000 men at best, and the Celtic charge broke the Roman army, and all resistance collapsed in an instant. The Romans retreated to a city called Veii. This was a city in Etruria, and they retreated under their commander, Marcus Furius Camillus, who was the dictator. The victorious Celts, they then swept into Rome under a man named Brennus, and they sacked the city. They did not take the Capitoline, the fortified area of Rome, but they plundered what they could, and they left the city before heading home. Now, the Romans never forgot this defeat. It was remembered for centuries afterwards as a day of mourning. There was no public buildings, shop was closed, no public business was held on that day. The sack was a humiliation that the Romans never overcame. The Romans fortified the city afterwards. They constructed the Servian walls, these large walls, large defensive structures to defend against future attacks. The Roman army, they perfected their tactics in the 4th and the 3rd century BCE to withstand the Celtic charge. They adapted various javelins and other missile weapons to counter the Celtic charge. The sack of the city forced the Romans to put their house in order. It forced them to put in place sound strategies to ensure that they would be able to better defend themselves against Celtic incursions and against that dreaded Celtic charge. Now, Rome ultimately benefited from the Celtic raids. The Celtic attack on the city of Rome itself led to the increase in sophistication and professionalization and diversification of the Roman army. The Celtic raids helped to break the power of some of the more established, wealthier, more powerful Etruscan cities. And Rome at the time was a very minor Italic city. The Celts were primarily occupied with attacking the larger, more wealthier cities of the Etruscan League, and Rome and the entire region of Latium. It was really underdeveloped compared to the Greek cities or the Etruscan cities. And again, in the south of Italy, you had the Greek cities, these cities that were home to the Greek colonists, and in sort of central Italy, to the north of Rome, you have these Etruscan cities that are just north of the plains of Latium, which is really the central portion of Italy, all the way to the Po River Valley. You have this very rich, fertile, developed area, and the Celts were drawn to the wealthier, to the more developed area because you had better spoils, better fights. The Celts went on to weaken the Etruscans, which boosted the Roman chances of supplanting the Etruscans in Italy. Now, again, the Romans were able to attract allies and build their confederation, their alliances, because of their reputation of being able to withstand and counter Celtic charges. The Celts, they did not just attack the Italian cities, they also attacked the eastern trade routes. They attacked trade routes from their Central European heartland along the Danube, and these routes brought the Celts into the Balkans. Now, the Celts in 281 BCE appeared on the Macedonian border. Now, the Macedonian king at the time was Ptolemy, a man named Ptolemy the Thunderbolt, who had just usurped the throne from his predecessor. Ptolemy the Thunderbolt assembled the Macedonian army, and he met this Celtic threat in battle. And Ptolemy and his army went down in crashing defeat. Poor Ptolemy's skull was eventually turned into a drinking cup for a Celtic king, for a Celtic tribal chieftain, I should say. And the Kingdom of Macedon, all of its core provinces, they were raided. raided and plundered. And this particular group of Celts got as far as central Greece. They nearly raided the temple at Delphi, and they terrified the Greeks all along the way. Now the Celts withdrew into the Balkans until they received an invitation from a king, Nicomedes of Bithynia, and he was a Philhellene. He was ruling over he was ruling in a Greek-style manner, in a in the manner of the Macedonian nobles that had sprung up and formed empires of their own after the collapse of the Archaeological dynasty. He was ruling there, and he hired the Celts as mercenaries and transported this group of Celts. It is believed that these three separate tribes numbered somewhere close to 40,000 to 45,000 people. He brought all the people to Asia Minor, and they served Nicomedes until he no longer needed them, at which point he turned them out of his kingdom, and afterwards they simply went into business for themselves, terrorizing Asia Minor for a generation, attacking cities, marauding, plundering, doing all of this in the countryside until they were brought under control by the Seleucid kings. The Seleucid kings, of course, were the heirs, were one of the heirs of Alexander in Asia. The king that defeated them was King Antiochus I. He defeated them, and really what he did was he used war elephants. The Celts, never seen an elephant before, were simply dumbfounded and confused, and they didn't know how to take down the elephants. The elephants overwhelmed the Celts, and the Celts were resettled on the Anatolian plateau in Asia Minor. Their descendants became the Galatians, based on the Greek Galatoi for Gaul. The Galatians very quickly adapted to Asia Minor. They take over the city of Gordian. They establish themselves as a warrior elite. They adopt Hellenism, and they engage in trade. And with that, we'll break on the discussion of the Celts. We're not done with the Celts. They still impact our discussion. So we'll break here on the Celts, and we'll then switch our focus, and we'll begin to look at early Germanic Europe. So in our examination of the Germans, we will look at these people who sort of, after the Celtic threat has been dealt with by the Romans and the Greeks, they become the epitome. They become, to a large extent, the epitome of what a barbarian is. And they are marked in Roman history and in Roman understanding as being the second most ferocious barbarian group after the Huns. The emergence of the Germans offer a watershed moment in Roman history, and really the history of like Western Eurasia. As the identity of the barbarian changes, has frontiers expand. With in the wake of Caesar's conquest of Celtic Gaul, the Balkans are conquered. The peoples there undergo Romanization, and they become provincial Roman citizens. The peoples on the other sides of these borders, on the other side of the Roman borders, they're now dubbed the New Barbarians. Before Caesar's conquest of Gaul, Rome had very little contact with the Germans. Caesar also holds the distinction of being the person who marked off the borders of Germania at the Rhine River. The borders of Germania will also include the Danube River, had the imperial boundaries in the east, in the east of Europe also expand. Now, the German tribes that Caesar encountered were compared to the Celts in Gaul. Caesar noted that they had a much lower material culture, but higher valor and a stronger sense of morality. Now, the later was a moral jab at the Romans, and to a lesser degree the Celts, who, due to their trappings of civilizations, they had learned wine drinking and trade networking from the Romans. It was a jab at the decline of Celtic martial prowess in the wake of Caesar's campaign, and also the decline in the moral attitudes of the Romans, had their society became wealthier, had they became open imperialists at all levels of their society. Caesar's description of the German tribes did make a very clear distinction between the Celts and the Germans. He made the distinction of that they were separate peoples. Now, the core lands that the Germans lived on were in the Baltic. These included the peninsula of Jutland, the Danish islands, southern Sweden, and the shores of northern Germany along the North Sea. In this area, during the Middle Bronze Age, around 1700 to 1800 BCE, Germanic civilization rose. Now, we have evidence that by 500 BCE, different dialects had emerged among the Germans. These dialects are the forebears of the modern languages of English, German, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. Now, their language was distinct from Celtic. German and Celtic, of course, are mutually unintelligible. We also know from archaeology that there was a great deal of trade between the Germanic tribes and the Celts. Many Celtic skill sets were transmitted to the Germans. Metalworking in particular is adopted by the Germans from the Celts. And from around 800 BCE, the metal technology of the Celts arrived in Scandinavia at a number of a large number really of Celtic prestige goods were exported to the Germans, and the spread of the awareness of writing. Now, there is a fair bit of controversy attached to this subject, and it is still a very ongoing and at times very difficult battle. But when the first runes or ancient Germanic alphabet were first developed, it is a very pertinent subject for many people interested in just the organization and the history of these early Germanic tribes, of this nascent German civilization. Now, the Germanic runes were based on the North Italic alphabet. Their writing system, their rune system developed, we believe, as soon as 200 BCE, and roughly around the mid 1st century BCE, we get reports. And these reports come from Julius Caesar that the Germans he encountered were consulting runes. That is, they were divining the future regarding battles using these runes. They also go to illustrate how the early Germans adapted Celtic and Mediterranean influences to fit their particular social needs. Another distinction Caesar made between the Germans and the Celts were their tendency to migrate. The Germans were always on the move. They were famed for their wagon trains, which they fortified and they used as a settlement while they were on the move. And agriculturally and technology-wise, they were rather simple people. They used slash and burn method for their agriculture, and of course, slash and burn wears out the soil very quickly, which necessitates this frequent relocation. Okay, with that being said, we'll break here and we'll come back and we'll continue our examination into the origins of German civilization. As always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about what we discussed as far as Celtic civilization is concerned. Let me know what you thought about what we discussed so far on early Germanic civilization. And I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.